Hello, viewers. This is Dr. Qamar Cheema, and viewers, please do subscribe my new channel. That is the new word with Dr. Cheema. As I told you earlier, that this is going to be an English language channel. So for that, I have requested Professor Dr. Soren Singh, who is right now teaching at University of British Columbia in Canada. Thank you very much, Professor Soren Singh, for your time.
Thank you, Kamal, for asking me to join your program today. I hope your viewers will have some takeaway from discussion that we are going to have today.
Sure, sir. Thank you very much. So, professors, I have few questions for you. And first, I want to ask you that how do you see India in this multilateral world? What we have been seeing is that India believes that India is challenging basically in its region mini multilateralism, and India is also trying to get into, or India is also trying to find out its space in by challenging in the bilateral world as well. So, how do you see the future of India in multilateral world, where different power players are in Indo Pacific and globally competing with each other?
Thank you. I think there are two levels at which one could answer the question you have raised. One, that this week is unusually interesting when it comes to any discussion on multilateralism. Because this week is having at least four very important multilateral summit meetings. G7, the developed economies, are going to have their summit meeting in Germany. Then you have North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO summit happening again. You have BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa summit meeting happening, chaired by China, but it's happening online. And the largest, of course, is the Commonwealth of Nations, that is called CHOGM, or the Commonwealth Heads of State meeting, which is happening in Rwanda. 54 nations are joining there. So this week is full of multilateral meetings. That shows that multilateralism is becoming the way of conducting global governance, international relations, and addressing all challenges which are increasingly now multilateral. Challenges are not limited to only one or the other nation states. Challenges are all interlinked, and therefore multilateralism is the way of life, shall we say. Second, I think because multilateralism is becoming the way of life, there are different genres of multilateralism that one notices now. For instance, during Cold War, we used to talk about multipolarism, which was largely power driven, and there were poles headed by powerful states. But at end of Cold War, we came back to what was known earlier as well, something called multilateralism, which is the debate today. And multilateralism usually is driven by norms, institutions, laws. National sovereignty is very important. So that is the kind of a kind of structure where processes are important to arrive at good decisions to make them effective. But within this multilateralism, we are also hearing two different kinds of gatherings. One, which is increasingly now becoming very fashionable, called plurilateralism, which is flexible, fluid, focuses on best practices, and then within the larger gathering, you could have smaller subsets, both of member states as also of issues which they are going to address. So it's a very flexible kind of plurilateral approach, which is being used now to address many global challenges. Before that, and something that is very relevant even today, is called mini-lateralism. Minilateralism usually focuses on a specific time bound issue, which again has a very limited number of countries, and often one of the major powers is driving that initiative, where you have limited number of states working for a limited period of time to achieve a limited objective. And so there are kind of multiple genre, as I said, of these international gatherings which are emerging. Let me quickly answer also the question that you raised about India. Before we come to brass tacks of how India is addressing specifics of multilateral organizations, to look at the nature of Indian society, I think that is very relevant. And because nature of Indian society is such that we have always spoken of unity in diversity. That means India is a very diverse society with all major religions around the world, various ethnicities, so many languages. So, in that sense, India is perfectly at home with the divergent voices, which is very often the challenge when countries go and engage in multilateral meetings, because different countries come with different kind of interests, different focus, different needs, and how to blend them together to achieve the optimal level of the initiative and outcome which will benefit everybody. And in that sense, India is culturally, civilizationally very comfortable with these sort of multilateral gatherings, which perhaps gives India a certain advantage in being comfortable in these multilateral gatherings. And I think you will soon ask me question also, and let me preempt you to ask that question. India being seen joining various multilateral organizations which are sometimes seen actually as competing with each other, but India is sitting in both of these or many of these, which otherwise seem to be contesting with each other. And I think that is a unique advantage that India has when it comes to dealing with issues of multilateralism as an approach to seeking solutions at global level.
Hmm. So, Professor, you have absolutely and wonderfully elaborated different facets of multilateralism as your plurilateralism or minilateralism. Obviously, you have explained that. Uh, obviously, how difficult do you believe is for India to engage with the United States, with the Russians, with the West, and while working with them? So there and with the Chinese as well. So how do you see that? How India is trying to cope up with this? Because do you, or if I could ask you that, what characteristics or the traits does India have that if it can engage with the communist China, it can engage with the liberal America, it can engage with the Russians, Putin's Russia, and it can engage with the rest of the world. So what do you think that what makes India to engage with all of them and keeping its distinction and keeping itself in its own shape, a country which is largely, known as the biggest democracy, having also called as an illiberal democracy and also called as a revisionist state. So how India is keeping all that in itself? So what characteristics do you believe India has for that matter?
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting question you have raised, Kamal. Other than the fact that I just alluded to India being a very diverse, civilizationally, culturally society, and that gives it advantage of dealing with such complex, diverse situations that multilateralism very often involves. And this week itself, Indian Prime Minister is joining both the G7 summit, which is United States and the most powerful economies of the world, and of course, at the same time, a day before, he will be sitting with BRICS nations, talking online to each other, which sometimes is not seen as kind of working in tandem, but working in competition with each other. And very often, you must have heard that BRICS is going to overtake G7 by 2030, etc. Kind of formulations are being made. But India will be joining this week in both these summits. Now, I would not say that it has no challenges involved for India. It definitely has challenges involved for India. For instance, sometimes some of these powerful states, as you mentioned, like United States in case of G7 or China in case of BRICS nations, would see India as either susceptible to other sides' pressures and criticism, or sometimes even look at India skeptically whether India is a kind of a genuine player in their gathering where they are seated, because obviously China is kind of focused on BRICS and US is focused on G7 nations meeting this week. Yes, so in that sense, it does involve a certain amount of challenge. But if you have heard Indian Foreign Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar repeatedly underlining now that increasingly India is not just a great civilization and a large society, but also increasingly seen as a very, very capable state where innovation, and of course, economic growth rates, and India now almost edging to shift from being the sixth largest to becoming the fifth largest economy on the planet. And the whole trajectory is about how by 2050 India would very likely be the second largest economy on the planet. So in that sense, the kind of weightage that India is increasingly drawing on international platforms, and the way various major powers are willing to engage India, it gives India a kind of a maneuvering space to say that India doesn't have to necessarily, as the foreign minister keeps saying, side with one or the other side. India has to side with itself, and therefore India's national interest is something that should guide India's foreign engagements and foreign policy. And to some extent, I would say that there is an increasing understanding among major powers today that India would be engaging these various multilateral forums that sometimes look like competing with each other on its own terms. And therefore, it's not something that India could be pushed around, or India is willing to piggyback any of the major powers. And that recognition is slowly, skeptically, but it is coming over a period of time. And I think that is both kind of the leverages that India has evolved over a period of time, but also I think the credit is due to the diplomatic core of India, which is actually delivering these communications and building that trust with various nations.
Hmm. So, Professor, moving forward, one thing we have been hearing, and what many scholars have been understanding from India, is that India somehow wants to be, or tries to be, or one day can be a net security provider to some of the smaller states in the region. And then at the same time, there are many people who are observing that India wants to be a revisionist state. So how do you see this, that does India really want to be revisionist state? One, and second, that to some extent, if India, since they are investing much of money on defense, and India remained the largest arms importer for a large period of time in the world. So how do you think that is India a revisionist state? One, and second, does India want to be a net security provider? Do you think that these are some of the goals which could be ultimately for India and its region?
Thank you, Qamar. I think this is a question that you perhaps can so easily understand. I'm sure you've heard repeatedly how one nation's freedom fighter can become other nation's terrorist. So definitely there is a issue of perceptions involved here. Whether India is a revisionist state or is conforming to existing international norms and institutions is a matter which is subjective, and it's open to interpretations. Therefore, what India is trying to seek is make sure it follows its own national interests. There are issues of climate change, poverty, healthcare, and these are important issues because ultimately any ruling party has to go to the voters for elections every 5 years, and if it is not delivering, and India has had examples one after another where very powerful parties are thrown out of power because they were apparently not delivering in the judgment of voters. So in that sense, I think it is a compulsion of national regimes or national leaders in India to pursue national interests deeply. And I'm not denying that India is not one of the largest importers of defense equipment, but the focus clearly is much more, not just in India, but globally, is on economic power, economic growth, welfare. So it is not simply the focus of nation state to defend borders, which of course is true and continues to be state's responsibility, but also to provide for its own communities inside. So even security has come to be blended and merged with development. Development is now part of security. Human security very well talks about freedom from fear and freedom from want, and looks at the insecurity beyond physical harm to be brought to any individual or any nation. So that is a global debate. India is part of that international system, and therefore, while it focuses on expanding and strengthening its armed forces, I think the primary focus definitely remains on providing basic amenities of life to common Indian citizen. And now, when it comes to, you mentioned India being a net security provider to the region, and that, of course, is not new. I go back to Hillary Clinton's time when President Obama was in White House. that India was beginning to be described by United States as a net security provider in the region. So I'm not saying India flaunts that we are, India is a net security provider. Other nations over a period of time are beginning to recognize that India can be a net security provider in the region. And I think pandemic has showcased how India can go out and provide uh, whatever help India can to dozens and dozens of nations. There was a point when India was supplying basic medicines for dealing with the issue of the coronavirus in about 100 countries. And then, of course, when it came to discovery of vaccines, again, India became the pharmacy of the world. India is the largest producer of vaccines and is distributing around the world. And in many cases, it's simply gifting these vaccines to countries. So there's a whole range of contributions that India is trying to make in terms of looking at security, not just in narrow military security, but also security in terms of welfare and well-being of people around the region and around the world. And whatever little contribution India can make, India is making. Two very quick examples right now that we are seeing is how in Ukraine and both in Afghanistan, India has made a very clear distinction that, of course, we could have benchmarks for the regimes to come true upon. They have to, showcase that they are following international requests or demand for, ensuring certain inclusivity or certain other benchmarks. But as regimes in these two nations work to find those solutions, local people should not suffer. So, therefore, India is providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, and thanks to Pakistan's providing of land route for Indian food grains going into Afghanistan, to Afghanistan as well. So, I think India is a net security provider in that broader sense of security in the region and not in a narrow militaristic sense of security.
Hmm. Well, Professor, moving forward, I'm just left with the two questions. So, okay, India is engaging with the world, and we can see that India is in Africa. They're engaging with the Latin America, with the North America, with everyone. But one thing which everyone is monitoring and looking is that the regional integration of India is missing. For instance, SAARC as a multilateral forum is no more a priority of India. Why do you think that if India's status is in a way getting more influential, or India is getting more influential, so India is also trying to undermine multilateral forum in the region? So, what is your perspective of that? Why is that so? This is because of obviously Pakistan, Kashmir, India, Pakistan bilateral problems getting into or punishing the region. So India is happy to connect with the world, I2, U2, Quad, and anything. But whatever the multilateral forum was available in the region, how do you see that if this forum has been compromised? What do you think is the mindset behind that, and what is the direction in your foreign policy for that?
Again, Kamar, you alluded to the central problem, and I'm sure you are trying to engage me on what is happening to SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. I would not deny that India-Pakistan misunderstandings or conflicts have been a primary reason in SAARC becoming ineffective. But I have always argued that SAARC is not been completely useless. SAARC has made very, very uh, pioneering initiatives in the past, whether it is SAPTA or SAFTA later, or it is sort of non-attack on each other's nuclear installations, which was largely bilateral between India and Pakistan. But most important, the 1987 Convention on Countering Terrorism, which is much before the world woke up to this problem. And so SAARC has had its positive contributions. And what is important to understand is that while SAARC summit may not have taken place for about 7 years now, all other structures of SAARC are still very much functional. Whether it is the SAARC University in New Delhi, or it is SAARC Secretariat in Kathmandu, and other various organs and institutions of SAARC, they are working normally. That's an important point to understand. Second, I think India's approach has been, and you could see it happening earlier also, in early 1990s, India had started something called Look East policy, which has now become
Yeah.
Look, which has now become Act East policy. Now, that was clearly a redefining of the foreign policy, because in the first about 30 years, India thought India was not very successful in engaging either the immediate neighbor in West or the immediate neighbor in North, which is Pakistan and China, and therefore wanted to expand its focus to Southeast Asia and East Asia. And likewise, you can notice again now in 2005 6 onwards, India has tried to have greater engagement with the immediate neighbors or the extended neighbors, whether you look at it in terms of BBIN, which is Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal arrangements, which are quadrilateral, or BIMSTEC, Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multisectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, or engagement with ASEAN, Indochina. So it is not that the regional countries of South Asia are suffering. You see these countries joining India in many of these other sub-regional or regional forums, and or in bilateral forums. So India's engagement with the immediate neighborhood has not come to an end, except I understand that between India and Pakistan, the formal dialogue has been not happening for almost 6 7 years now. But even within India, Pakistan, you can notice I just gave example of Pakistan allowing India's food grains to go overland through Pakistan into Afghanistan. So it's not that nothing has happened between India and Pakistan also. So yes, that's one part, that India's immediate neighborhood, SAARC has, at least the summit level has not happened, but several other things have happened. And second, very quick important point to make, India in last 20 25 years has changed. You can notice that Indian Prime Minister has chosen to participate in BRICS and G7 summit, and Indian Foreign Minister is going to be representing India in Commonwealth of Nations head of government meeting in Rwanda. So, in that sense, the stature of India has moved away from the least developed poor countries to now emerging economies. So, therefore, it has a limited kind of leverages and time and efforts to devote in engaging itself in delivering to the world. And therefore, larger engagement focus of India now is obviously with the middle powers, emerging economies, and great powers, which perhaps doesn't leave as much time and effort to be devoted to uh, groups like non-alignment movement, or Commonwealth of Nations, or the G77 groups, or SARC, as you mentioned. So I think it's a clear evolution of India's foreign policy, which explains how India sees it can best contribute to international peace and development.
Hmm. Well, one last question, Professor, I have for you is about India's image problem. Most recently, what we have seen that, for example, the U.S. State Department is commenting about the recent religious rights, or what we call religious protests in India, and even the Muslim world has protested for that matter. So, do you think that somehow this is a challenge for India, and India does have, or Indian foreign policy does give a space in its apparatus to this challenge?
I think that's a very important question to address, because any emerging country would have to constantly work on managing perceptions, because very often, whenever rapid transformation, rapid development happens in any society, not only it gets sort of rattled internally, it also rattles external viewers or other countries who are building their alignments and realignments with that rapidly emerging country. So perception management, I would never doubt, is an important responsibility for Indian leaders. But also, I think, Kima, you understand, Kamal, you fully understand, uh, the focus of international scrutinies often lies on major powers, and particularly on rapidly emerging powers. So I would not say that other countries have no problems, the kind of problems you mentioned about India. But I don't want to name any of the smaller countries which could be worse than what you could pinpoint in case of India. But definitely, India comes into global focus because India is a large state and rapidly emerging as an influential player. And therefore, other countries want to really scrutinize and carefully see everything that is happening in India. And India is not the only country in that sense. Look at what happens in all kinds of reports that we keep reading about the United States, Black Lives Matter, and others, or China, which is another emerging large power, about what is happening in Xinjiang. So you will notice that the larger powers are already, sort of scrutinized very, very seriously, and this increasing scrutiny on India is part of that change that India is undergoing. For a moment, I'm not saying that India has no challenges. India definitely has many challenges to work upon, but to focus exclusively on those challenges and overlook the kind of positive and very, very kind of game changing developments that are happening in the country, both internally and in terms of its engagement in international affairs, is something that is not fair. I think a fair analysis would look at both the positive uh, developments in India, both inside and its engagement with outside world, and of course also pinpoint to the challenges that India has and how globally nations can help each other in overcoming those challenges. I believe India and Pakistan can enormously contribute by complementing each other in addressing the fundamental challenge of terrorism, for example. So, no country today can do everything by itself, howsoever powerful that country can be. So, therefore, I think increasingly, as you started this discussion today, multilateralism is the way we can resolve most of both internal and external challenges. The sooner we understand what kind of multilateralism we need to develop in what kind of situations to address what kind of challenges, and tailor make it, develop that kind of structures, processes specific to both the leverages that nations have and the challenges that they face, is how I think one can maximize resolving issues that are undermining their growth and development. And I believe India is on the cusp of change, and therefore India is trying to redesign its engagement around the world.
Hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Soren Singh, for eloquently and wonderfully giving us a perspective to the multilateralism and how Indian and what is the direction of the Indian foreign policy for that matter. And we discussed wide range of issues, starting from the global politics, how India is engaged, and definitely how India is engaged in its region, and obviously from inside, what are the challenges. Thank you very much, Professor Soren Singh,
Thank you,
once again.
Kamar, and my best wishes to your program. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.